And the St. Thomas Academy and Visitation debate team, along with students from the dance and government classes, are excited to present this debate between the candidates for Minnesota House of Representatives, seat 52B. We would like to thank the administration of St. Thomas Academy for agreeing to host the debates, and to thank the building staff and Mr. John Geroux for setting up the facility and audiovisual resources.
At this time, we would like to introduce the candidates. On this side will be the Republican challenger, Mr. John Geroux, and on this side will be Democratic incumbent, Representative Joe Atkins. Both candidates are commended for their willingness to take part in the debate based on the issues rather than personalities or partisan labels. We would like to ask the audience to please refrain from partisan displays of applause, boo, or anything else that will distract the focus on the important issues facing our state.
According to the format created by our fellow students and agreed to by the candidates, each candidate will have a 3-minute introductory statement and a 3-minute closing statement. The order was determined by a coin flip prior to the debate, and Donald Lee will present his introductory statement first, and Joe Atkins will go first in his closing statements.
All questions will be asked of both candidates, with the candidates alternating who answers first. The candidate answering first will be allowed a minute and a half for his answer. The second candidate will be allowed 2 minutes with a 30-second opportunity for follow-up or rebuttal. First candidate. All these questions have been created by students in the St. Thomas Academy AP Government class and will be read by students from both schools.
At the end of these questions, each candidate will be allowed to ask each other a question. The answering candidate will have 2 minutes to answer the question with a 30-second follow-up by the questioner. The order of this section will be determined by a coin flip just before it begins.
The debate will then end with closing statements. You're welcome to applaud on both candidates and finish their concluding remarks. At this time, we would like our timer to get ready, and we invite Mr. Lee to begin.
Actually, I think we flip-flopped. I asked Don if he wanted to go first or second. He said second, so I'll go first, if that's all right with you guys.
Sounds good.
Good. Before we start timing them, I think on behalf of both Don and I, and probably everybody here, and we hear it for our St. Thomas Academy of Visitation. All this ever happening before, so they deserve a lot of credit, as Mr. Hoverson, who has been kind enough to help out as well, but thank you all. So, first off, who's a senior in this room? Senior in high school. So, I was actually thinking I was out knocking some doors. This is my door knocking close a few blocks away. It dawned on me about 30 years ago, almost exactly. I just sold 5,000 candy bars. In order to afford a trip to go to Europe with my German class, and for the first 3 weeks I wandered around with my German class. Then the last 3 weeks, the plan was that I was going to bicycle from Munich to Paris, which on the map is only about yay far. Turns out it's about 1,000 miles with the direction that I took. But just as I got across the French border, I came across this clay tennis court. I was a bit of a tennis player in high school. Never seen a clay tennis court before. There's 2 folks playing. There's another guy standing about where Don was. And we tried conversing. It turns out he spoke just French. I spoke just English. But the 2 of us spoke a little bit of German. And so we're trying to converse back and forth in German. And I was, frankly, bragging a little bit. I was telling him that in the fall, I was actually going to go to the University of St. Thomas, then the College of St. Thomas, and play tennis there. And that we were the #2 college tennis team in Division III in the United States. Well, that's what I said. What he heard was that I was actually the #2 college tennis player in all of America, which wouldn't have been so bad, but it just so happened that the #2 amateur tennis player in all of France was just down the road, and he was in town. So they set up a match for the 2 of us to play that evening. And he came down, and I thought to myself, what's the worst thing that can happen, right? I lose a little bit of tennis. So I get there, and there's bleachers that have been brought in, about the size of this and the size of this. There's 600 people there to watch us play tennis. And I actually won the first game, and then proceeded to lose the next 12 games in a row, as they're waving flags and cheering, and it was, I tell that story though, because I then spent the next 3 days in that town, kind of in an unplanned fashion, getting to know a lot of people, finding out about learning some French, learning French culture a little bit, had just a great time. And I tell that story for a reason, which is because one of the most important things that we have, and one of the things that I think I bring to learn the lesson from that, that I bring to the legislature is an ability to talk to both sides. Just because Republicans are Republicans and Democrats are Democrats doesn't mean that we're at odds with one another. It just means we have a little bit different approach. And if you take the time to go across the aisle and actually talk to one another, it's amazing what you can learn from one another if you're willing to drop the partisan stuff for a little while and talk. And just like what I experienced when I was in France, I have, as a result of simply listening to both sides, managed to pass more bipartisan legislation in the last 6 years than any other state representative. Not on just ridiculous stuff, but on important things. Things like finding missing kids, helping police officers find missing kids. The most advanced, the biggest advances in fire safety laws in the last 30 years. Job creation, tax cuts with respect to unemployment insurance. And the reason I've been able to do that is because, frankly, I've just gotten out of my chair, walked across to the other side, learned from each other, and it's amazing what you can do when you're willing to talk to one another and get things done. As a result of doing that, in the last 12 months, the Minnesota police officers have named me their legislator of the year. Minnesota firefighters named me their legislator of the year. Minnesota nurses named me their legislator of the year, and so did the American Cancer Society, Minnesota chapter. It's the first time in state history that anybody did that. I tell you that not to brag about myself, but to tell you what you can accomplish when you're willing to listen to one another. My main goal here today, and thank you again to the St. Thomas and Visitation students for putting this on, is to hear from my friend Don. We've done some things together. We did a food drive together a few months ago. I expect to learn a great deal from him. I'd also like to take some time afterwards and listen to you. Even regardless of who you're voting for, we're not enemies with one another. The aim here is we're all Minnesotans. In fact, I realized I had on my Minnesota shirt today. But it's amazing what we can do when we work together. And with that, I'll reserve a little bit of time. I'll give it perhaps to my friend Don and turn it over to Mr. Lee.
Thank you, sir. I also want to thank all of you for being here. This is what self-government is all about. Not protests demanding our rights, it's about citizens being the government. It's about choosing. Mr. Atkins and I agreed to do this because we believe these discussions are important. About me, I'm not an incumbent. Connie and I have lived in Egan since 1980. We've married for 36 years, raised our kids here, in the same house since 1985. I have a long career in software development and software engineering. I'm running because I think our state is going in the wrong direction. I want you to hire me, and this is a job interview. You do the hiring and firing through your votes. Our Constitution says that people run the government, not the other way around. Representative Atkins and I hold the microphones, but you are in charge. I think you'll see a real contrast here this afternoon with two very different visions of what government is and what it should do. You need to choose between them. Remember that one of us will spend the next 2 years representing all of you. There's been much finger wagging lately. People ask, why can't they get along and get things done? But remember, the Minnesota legislature is not a factory. When the legislature makes law, we are all compelled to follow it. Our Constitution makes lawmaking hard because good law is stable, minimal, and simple. Only laws enjoying broad consensus should be passed. A legislator's job is not to make as many deals as he can. His oath is to follow and defend the Constitution. His duty is to preserve liberty, not to control people. That is the job description at the core of this discussion today. Coach Hoverson and the students of St. Thomas and Visitation understand the importance of this event. They've organized it for all of us, and we are grateful for their efforts and for the use of this excellent facility. I encourage each of you to reach out to your neighbors who are not here today. Share what you learned here. Encourage them to join you in diligent oversight of your government. Let the discussions begin.
Now we will flip for sides. One of you like to go ahead in the air?
Heads.
As it is. So the first question is
the first two questions are education. So the first, today's high school students are concerned about the high cost of college. Do you support tuition rate freeze at public universities? And if not, how will you help students meet the cost of the education, which is considered essential to the jobs of the future, without assuming massive debts?
This is a difficult and complex question. And it has to do with the value of education, how it's financed, and the choices people make. We hear a lot about college debt, but that debt is assumed voluntarily because those college students assume they're going to make more money because they get a good education. We hear that it's such a tragedy that they have debt after they assume debt, so why shouldn't we just forgive them? Well, why shouldn't we forgive all debt? We don't operate that way. When you borrow money, you're expected to pay it back. And what's the value of education? And why should you pay for a college student's education? The college student is the one who's benefiting from it, so the college student should pay for it. The whole idea of public education is aimed at the young ones, to make sure that we have citizens who can read and write and do basic math. But that basic education has grown into an enormous industry, costing trillions of dollars. And from what I see of college students today, many of them are not getting educations that are necessarily going to give them a lot of income. So why is it that the taxpayer should foot the bill for all this education that isn't going anywhere? Now the question asked is, how do we solve this problem? Talk about tuition freezes, talk about how the state should control this monster that it has created. Well, the first thing to do, I'm out of time.
I'm okay if you want a little bit more time. Guys, can you remind me how the rules, do I get 2 minutes to respond to this as well?
You get 2 minutes, then he gets 30 seconds to give a rebuttal on your statement.
Sounds like a plan, thank you. Yes, I support a freeze. I supported the freeze that went into place 2 years ago. I support an ongoing freeze. There used to be a covenant between Minnesota families and the state of Minnesota and our institutions of higher learning, and that is we split the cost. Families picked up half the cost, and the state picked up half the cost. That then changed dramatically over the last decade and a half, where now we've got students and their families are picking up 2/3 of the cost. For the first time in a long time, over the last couple of years, we froze tuition, not just at the University of Minnesota, but at all colleges and institutions across the state of Minnesota. That had an indirect impact as well, in that the colleges are competing with one another. Many of the private colleges followed suit because they're competing with the university, they're competing with state colleges. They did the same thing. It worked, and I hope to continue, and I expect to continue doing it again for the next 2 years. The other side is the part that Don referenced in terms of the debt side. One of the things that we did just this last year, and by the way, student debt is eating people up. How many of you were able to afford your own way through college like I was? Some hands, how many think their kids will be able to do that? 1, 2, 3, that's terrific. And my kids are almost there, they're all working full time in order to try to pay their own way. But it's a whole different equation now than it used to be. The challenge is we've got, in addition to the high cost, we also didn't give students the right to refinance. They had to stick with that same lender. We've now allowed them not only to consolidate, but to refinance, to go out into the market and get competing bids. We just did that in 2014. I expect that when you have banks that are competing, or lenders that are competing for your business, you'll be able to bring those rates down, just like you can with your own mortgage. So we've, besides the freeze, we've also done the element with respect to allowing for refinancing, and those two pieces I think are critical. I still got time left if you want to complete your... All right, never mind. We'll go on to the next one.
30 seconds. I think if you go back in the history of the legislation in the last 15 years, you'll find that there have been numerous tuition freezes and programs to hold down the cost. and I think it's safe to say it's not working. Costs continue to go up, the cost of college education keeps going up, and we hear more and more talk of how the education is inadequate, how it's not doing the job, how there's disparities. I think a little freedom, a little flexibility, and not run from St. Paul is the answer, not more programs.
Some Minnesota school districts have a high disparity between performance outcomes of different groups of students. Would you support basic teacher pay on performance-based measures? If so, how would this system set up? If not, why not? Why not? And what other methods could be used to improve teacher quality?
And you've actually, I assume my time starts, you're mixing two items there, and I appreciate that. One is the achievement gap, and one is how to compensate teachers and reward performance. First off, to answer the question, do I support performance pay for teachers? Yes, I do. A good teacher, I think, ought to be compensated for doing a good job. As far as the achievement gap, there is no silver bullet, and simply compensating a teacher more or less, depending on achievement, doesn't get at it. As a former school board member, I can tell you there's multiple ways to address this. Probably the single most important thing to do is to start early. And I look at some of the folks in the room, I know that your kids, like my kids, if you start by reading to them, I mean, the first thing is, as a parent, read to your kids early. But as far as in terms of what government's able to do, give early educational opportunities. We also just did voluntary all-day kindergarten, made that available across the state, regardless of where you live. So it's not just rich kids versus poor kids, it's every kid. And we've got, part of the reason we've got such a significant achievement gap in Minnesota is frankly because a certain population, namely white kids in Minnesota, do really, really well. Some African-American kids, some Hispanic kids, some other kids of color also do really well. But as a population, they're a little bit more challenged in terms of that achievement. So there's early ed, there's all-day voluntary K, and then the other thing is, believe it or not, making more AP classes available. That is one of the most beneficial things that we can do for young people, is make them available not just to the high achievers, but to everybody. The outcome of that actually benefits everybody. And with that, I'll turn it back to Don.
It always amazes me when people talk about things like pay for performance and claim that what you pay teachers has nothing to do with their performance. Every industry, every business pays their employees, and if they're not doing the job, they stop paying for them. And that produces a little better performance in the ones who are left behind, and it gets rid of the ones who aren't doing the job. In Minnesota, we have very strict rules imposed by the Minnesota legislature that say, if you get hired in a school, it's almost impossible to fire you. And if you're not at the bottom of the seniority list, you can't be fired. The legislature tried to change this and say, let's allow the local school boards and administration to fire teachers who are not doing the job. And the legislature said, nope, actually I think it was the governor who vetoed it. I mean, this is nuts. This isn't bad policy, it's just nuts, and it's a pattern. Legislature thinks that they have the solution for every school all across the state, and they don't. There are special interests who want that strict seniority system, Minnesota Teachers Union, and they get it because they make deals with legislators and make sure that they get what they want. I think it is reasonable to say that if you want to improve the situation with the schools, you have to give them some flexibility to do their jobs. The parents, the administrators, the teachers have a much better idea of what needs to be done to fix their education than do legislators. And frankly, I think legislators should butt out. And that would be mostly my plan if I get in the legislature, to give the local schools the flexibility to do their jobs. And to me, that is not rocket science.
In addition, what I would add, just because I'm afraid that there may not be additional educational questions, one of the key things that we have to work on in 2015 and 16 is fairer funding for suburban schools. Until the last election, we haven't had a cohort of suburban, regardless of politics, whether you're Democrat or Republican, Suburban schools have gotten short shrift in terms of the funding equation because we just haven't had as much representation there. So my hope is that we will see a shift in terms of how suburban schools are financed when we get into session, regardless of whether you elect Don or me. Either one of us will be working on that same issue in 2015.
These next questions will be lifestyle questions. While we don't want to communicate the wrong idea about us through this question, would you support allowing bigger stores and other retail outlets like brewery, taverns to sell alcohol on Sundays? Alcohol allowing car dealers to do one on Sundays as well?
This one's to you, Don.
This one's to me. The simple answer to the question is yes. The more complete answer is yes, slowly, because Minnesota actually has quite a large number of specific laws about liquor wholesalers and beer wholesalers and distribution and Sunday sales and so forth. And in principle, I don't see why the state of Minnesota should be telling businesses when they can and cannot be open. And did I understand the question correctly? Basically allowing Sunday sales, right? The other part of the answer is the reason we have not done that is because there are a number of powerful special interests who get benefit from those laws, and their business models depend on them. So they are at the Capitol making absolutely sure that those laws don't change. So you run into a buzzsaw when you try to change them, but I think they should be changed.
Let's see, I just want to find out why you're looking to buy booze on Sunday, young man. Actually, there really are not powerful special interests when it comes to Sunday sales. What happens is Sunday sales gets proposed each time, virtually every year. And it's got a decent amount of support among both legislators and among the public. But then a funny thing happens, and it's all these little mom and pop liquor stores. Some of the big giants would love to be open on Sunday. But it's the little mom and pop liquor stores that start to call. And what they indicate to us is that what you're going to be doing then is spreading 7 days of revenue over 6 days. Or 6 days of revenue over 7 days, my apologies. And what they'll have to do is hire more people. Right now their margins are very thin, so that means rather than hiring additional people, it means mom or pop will be working the desk on Sunday. And they call, and it's 4 or 5 of my local liquor stores, and in certain places with municipal liquor stores, it's the local mayor and the city council members that start calling their individual legislators. And by the time the vote is taken, it's 110 to 24 that it fails, because all of those folks feel very strong about it. Now that being said, tap rooms are now going to be open on Sunday. I actually carried that legislation. We were able to talk with all of the various interests and figure out a way to allow for that. As far as the car dealers, that issue has not come up, and frankly, I haven't heard from a constituent in years that wants to do that. I really don't know if it would have legs or not. Huh? I think he gets 30 seconds to...
It's a simple question of principle. Should the state legislature be dictating when businesses are open without a really good reason? The liquor sales are old blue law. Popular or not, it's probably not appropriate for the state to be doing that dictation. And as far as popularity, yeah, there may be people who are in favor or opposed to it, but that doesn't change the principle. And the powerful special interests are the ones who stir up the people to make the phone calls. Anyone who's involved in politics knows how that works.
Another lifestyle question?
Yes.
All right.
Another recreational drug that's been in the news recently is e-cigarettes. Do you favor more or less regulation of e-cigarettes? Why or
I think so. I think it's a little too soon to tell. I don't fully appreciate or know what the science was with respect to cigarettes. It seems to me that if the risks are the same as a normal cigarette, then the regulations ought to be the same as for a normal cigarette. Sorry I didn't fill the whole time.
Switching. Again, it's a question of principle. Should new products first have to go before the legislature before they can be sold? Or should they be sold and regulated and taxed and limited only when there's some evidence that they're harmful? E-cigarettes have not shown any particular evidence of being harmful, and I think they should be left alone.
You're right, Don, we do have a little bit of a disagreement there, because there's some, your perspective, your philosophy is to let anything be sold until it's proved to be harmful. What if somebody dies? Then we would regulate it. I think there ought to be, especially with products that are potentially harmful, where we take a look ahead of time before they're put on the product or put on the market, just like we do with other drugs. It's too much at stake in order to apply that philosophy to every drug that comes available to the public.
The legislature recently passed a law changing how marijuana may be used in Minnesota. Would you change the law currently in place, and if so, how? Would you support legalization of recreational marijuana?
On principle, I think I would. It is not a question that comes up very often. We have effectively done it recently, legalized marijuana, by legalizing medicinal marijuana. As we've seen in other states, it tends to become recreational because there are lots of reasons to declare that you probably need it for some medical reason. That said, there's a long argument about personal responsibility, about whether you should do it now, whether it should be taxed, whether it should be regulated. I think such a thing should be done carefully. Alcohol certainly has a lot of problems, and we have some regulations having to do with drunk driving and so forth. I think it's something that should be done thoughtfully, but in principle, yes, I would lean toward legalizing.
If I remember right, the first question was, would you change the law? John, you said yes to that?
Lean.
Lean, yes. I'd say no. And with respect to recreational marijuana, I'd also say no. The law that was adopted in Minnesota took a long time to get crafted, and at the end of the day, it was actually the Minnesota Police and the Police and Peace Officers Association that begrudgingly abided by that. For that very reason, Don said these sorts of things can end up being used recreationally. The reason that police officers bought into it at the end of the day is because what we did in Minnesota is not smoking it. It's the liquid form and oil form, so that it can't be used as easily recreationally. And frankly, I think it's too soon to talk about recreational use of marijuana. There's a lot of folks that talk about that being a gateway to more serious drugs and being a gateway to crime, and I think that's wrong. I think we ought to see what happens in places like Colorado and Washington. And they've just started doing that, and it's too soon to tell whether or not we've seen wholesale changes in their criminal activity, whether we've seen it as a gateway drug to other drugs, and I just think it's wrong to adopt that at this stage without more understanding what the impact would be. You got 30.
Yeah, I'm going to use the 30 seconds to go back to a previous question. The one of, what if somebody dies?
Good.
We do this all the time. People sell ladders, shoes, bathtubs, all sorts of things that, screwdrivers, knives. People can die from these things, but we don't take every last product and send it to the legislature and say, will you let us sell this, please? That's not how it works.
Apart from all these substances with release of healthcare, without mentioning President Obama in your answer, what needs to change with the way health insurance is provided in Minnesota, and what would you propose to change?
I think this one's to me first, right? Number one, I'd get MNsure working. We've got wonderfully competitive plans, you know, the Blue Cross and the Medicas and the health partners are fiercely competitive with one another. They've put some phenomenal products available via MNsure, but if you can't get through the website, you can't buy it. Literally, regardless of who you believe on the rates, we do have the lowest rates in the country. That's the one thing that both Democrats and Republicans agree on, but if you can't access them, you can't buy the plan. So I supported hiring a new vendor. We had an IT vendor that just couldn't get the job done. We fired him. We got a new vendor. And the new vendor now has 99% of the people getting through MNsure successfully and being able to get through the eligibility and buy a plan. In addition to that, I worked with the National Federation of Independent Business, not exactly a liberal organization, pretty conservative group, about bringing additional competition into the small business market, where small businesses are able to buy more flexible plans and as a result find plans that fit their employees well and bring down the cost of health insurance. Done.
I want to thank Mr. Atkins for being forthright about that. If anyone would know what's broken and what needs fixing in MNsure, it would be him, since he is head of the committee overseeing it, and he was chief author for the bill. But I have to point out that the promises so far have not been kept, and I see no reason to think that the promises in the future will be kept. I have a lot more to say on this subject later, but I think it's fair to say that you really should be skeptical when anyone tells you that something like MNsure that ignores reality and ignores economics, jacks up the cost, and then says your costs are going to go down, is actually going to save you money and give you better care. This is a lot like somebody who comes along and breaks your legs and then tries to sell you a wheelchair. This is not good policy. What was the question again? What would I do to fix it? Markets. Markets are not optional. They are not something we could try. They exist. They're unavoidable. Markets are why MNsure isn't working. The reason preferred one, the one with 60% of the customers in MNsure pulled out, is because it's not financially or administratively sustainable. Let's translate that. They don't see any way they're going to make money at it. And administratively unsustainable means they can't work with the MNsure board. They don't see a way to make it go. This is serious problems. Markets work. If you let customers buy things, they drive the price down. Think of LASIK. Think of cosmetic surgery. Anywhere that markets are allowed to work, they do work. And medical care is nothing different.
And we agree. Markets work. That's frankly, at the end of the day, all that MNsure really is. We've got 200 and some odd plans that have been filed on MNsure. People can buy any plan that they want to. And what's driving the price downwards is that now it's an apples to apples comparison from one plan to the next. You know precisely what you're getting, as opposed to, anybody remember the old days when you go to buy health insurance? As an employer, we had a heck of a time buying health insurance because everybody had an apple and an orange and a pear, and it was hard to compare them, let alone get them to compete against one another. That's the one thing that MNsure has going for it, is competition. Guessing this is a visitation suite.
Yes.
Also on the debate team?
I'm sorry?
Also on the debate team?
No. Just the government.
All right.
Many of us will be able to vote for the first time in the next few years. Do you support requiring ID rules for voting in Minnesota? If so, how would you provide for those who have significant obstacles in obtaining voter identification? And what forms of ID should be allowed?
That's yours. It's mine.
No, I think that was
I lost track. It's mine? Is it me?
Yeah, if you guys, when you ask the question, if you could remind us who's up next.
Sorry.
We're losing track.
I often tell people that the most important thing we have, it's not our Constitution, it's not any of the wealth that we have, it's the fact that we have the consent of the government. We have a nation of people who all agree that our system of government is valid. When we have an election, the winner gets to take office. We don't have riots, we don't have civil wars. That is consent of the government. If you look around the world, that is not universal. The universal is people fight, they have guns, they kill each other over the right to govern. We have consent of the government. The reason we have consent of the government is because we have faith in our elections. We believe that they are honest, and we believe that they're done fairly. Voter ID is about keeping that sense of fairness in our elections, in ensuring that the people who vote are the ones who are entitled to vote, and they only vote once. If you listen to the folks on the other side of this, and I think voter ID is an excellent idea. I think it's a minimal provision. You can offer people free IDs. That is not a big barrier. It's just not a big problem. And it's a minimal thing to make sure people are who they are, say they are, and only vote once. To listen to the other side, you'd think that getting an ID was like going to South Africa, or that it cost $1 million, or they can't possibly do it. It's just not true.
I don't support it. I think it's basically an effort at disenfranchising people that have a difficult time getting an ID. The bottom line is, unless you can demonstrate to me that there's significant voter fraud occurring in Minnesota, which there's not. There have been 12 cases of voter fraud in the last 10 years. And I believe only one was successfully prosecuted. So all it is an impediment to certain populations in an effort to keep them from voting. Is my perception of what's going on with respect to voter ID. By the way, I've got a daughter who votes for the first time. She just turned 18 on Thursday. So this will be her first time getting the opportunity to vote. And I hope all of you will take advantage of that as well. Are you old enough to vote?
Right.
Super. All right. Don?
I think it's a bit of a low blow for those who object to voter ID to accuse those who want it of trying to disenfranchise the voters. I don't think there's anything disenfranchising about insisting that people use their driver's licenses, for instance, to go to the polls, which is the same thing you do to cash a check, to buy liquor. You use it all day long. You go to the library card. The DFL caucus requires an ID to go into the caucus. Come on, guys, this is, no. And a lot of elections are decided by very few votes, so it's important.
Sometimes it seems as if the average citizen has little voice in politics compared to major corporations. Is there a problem with money influencing politics in Minnesota? How should Minnesota combat that?
That's a great question. My sense, at least at the state level, is that there is not a significant issue. In terms of folks in Inver Grove Heights, Mendota Heights, Sunfish Lake, Egan, that I represent, folks have my phone number, they have my email, I read my own email. I'm much more likely to respond to a constituent email concern than I am to worry about what a particular special interest may have to say with respect to it. The one issue that does come up, though, and I think it's really a matter of disclosure, is there's all kinds of what's called dark money. There's any number of groups now, 501c4 type groups, that are spending a lot of money in elections. In fact, most of the ads that you're seeing on TV right now aren't run by the candidates themselves. They're run by all of these outside organizations that come in and run the most obscene, horrible, half-truth type of, and that's true on both sides. And then at the end, you see it's some organization that you've never heard of who doesn't have to disclose their donors. I don't have a problem with the ads. This is America. Everybody should be able to say whatever they want to, and smart voters will figure out whether or not it makes sense or not. But at least let me know who's paying for it. Disclosure, and folks, there's people on both sides of the aisle, Democrats and Republicans, who agree with this point of view. At least disclose who's running the ad, who's paying for the ad, so that then people can judge for themselves what sort of credibility they want to assign to that ad.
Citizens United got it right. Free speech in this country, if you want to get more than one room full of people, takes money. And Mr. Atkins says that voters are smart, they can figure things out. Great. If a candidate doesn't tell you who paid for his ads, don't vote for it. If you got a bunch of ads on TV that you don't like, turn it off. The money in politics is always decried by the incumbents, and often by the big political parties who don't like the competition. The money is something that evens this playing field for the challenger against those in power. Do you really want those in power being able to pass judgment on who gets to run based on who financed them? Who donated? I don't think that's a good idea. Especially when people like the New York Times, which is a big corporation, they can put effectively full-page ads in their newspaper calling for this or that public policy or supporting. It's called editorials. It's called endorsements. Are we going to clamp down on them too? And if not, why not? The Supreme Court said, effectively, you need money to have a loud voice. And Congress does not have the power to control your voice, so it shouldn't control the money either. If voters are smart and they can pick their candidates based on those sorts of issues, so be it. Like I said, you guys are in charge.
And folks remember, no, I didn't say to ban it, I just said it makes sense to disclose who's paying for it. That's just the honest way to do it. The additional piece that I would add, I'm so keen on the issue of keeping money from influencing. I won't let anybody, even my own neighbor, buy me a cup of coffee. I started that when I was mayor of Inver Grove Heights, and I continued it in the legislature because I don't want there to be any sort of perception that somebody can buy my vote for anything. I was also one of 18 legislators out of 134 who voted against an effort to allow lobbyists to buy dinner for legislators as long as they did it for everybody. It just didn't seem like an appropriate way to approach how we do business. Sorry for going a little over there, Nolan. How are we doing so far, folks? Are we keeping you in your seats? It's like a basketball game, right?
Many of us enjoy the outdoor life in Minnesota. What additional steps can or should Minnesota take to combat invasive species?
Say it again?
What additional steps? I'll read the question again. Many of us enjoy the outdoor life in Minnesota. What additional steps can or should Minnesota take to combat invasive species?
Oh man. That's a tough question. It's a little bit like asking how you control Ebola. Invasive species come in the ballast water of ships. They come in, in shipments of lumber. They got lots of ways to get here. And once here, sometimes they spread like wildfire. They compete with you and stuff. Sometimes there are things you can do, and sometimes you can't. I think that's just way too complicated a question. Should the state have a role? I think it should. The DNR works very hard to keep invasive species down. Most of what they do is a losing battle, like the purple loosestrife, the zebra mussels. But the effort should be made, and I support that effort. It's a big effort. Sometimes money's involved, like the carp up in Mississippi. I'm not sure how to answer the question. Yes, something should be done, but it's this big.
And this is a good philosophical question as well, because this is one of those times where government does play a role, for the most part, in my opinion, government should help those when they need help, but stay out of the way when we don't. This is one of those areas where collectively working together, we can do much more than we can on our own. The two most important things that we can do in terms of fighting invasive species, number one is education. Most Minnesotans, I think the beginning of the question said that, we care about the environment, we care about the outdoors. If we just know about the problem, and it's kind of in our face and we're hearing about it, we tend to do a much better job of making sure that we clean our boat when we take it out of the water and before we put it in elsewhere. The second thing that we can do is barriers, and there's a variety of different types of barriers that can be used. Minnesota is doing a pretty good job in terms of both. But invasive species are tough. I think Don hit it on the head. They're coming at us, folks, from every different direction. So the most important thing we can do is education, and number two is to create those barriers.
I don't think I have anything more to say on that. I think we mostly agree on this one. I think we might disagree on how and which specific steps, but yeah, it's an important thing to do. I do want to encourage everyone on the last question to visit the Campaign Finance Board and take a look at the financial reports for our campaigns. All of the numbers are there. How much money we have in the bank, where we got it in detail. Draw your own conclusions.
With the recent oil natural gas boom in the neighboring state, fracking and the mining of fracking sand has become an important issue. Should Minnesota increase regulation of either fracking or sand mining? If so, how? If not, why not?
Number one, I think the evidence is not there yet to support additional regulation with respect to it. There is two competing schools of thought, neither one of which are fully studied at this point. So to go in and regulate it without knowing more about it, I think would be premature. One of the bigger impacts, though, and I'm going to fade off on your question a little bit, is one of the huge byproducts of North Dakota's oil boom is the congestion that we're seeing here in Minnesota on our rail lines. That is a growing crisis. What we've got, you've got farmers competing to get their product to market. They're now paying 5 times as much to get it on rail as they are. And the reason that is a significant issue is because it impacts the price of a loaf of bread. It impacts the price of milk. It impacts our ability to get propane to those folks that suffered last winter and were down to a few gallons when we had the propane crisis last winter. If there's an issue that's being caused by the North Dakota oil boom, which I think is wonderful, by the way. I mean, you go outside, you've got $2.95 gallon gas, right? I mean, it's been June of 2006 was the last time we saw on a sustained basis that kind of price for a gallon of gas. So I think that's great, but we've just got to make sure that we address those impacts. In order to do that, we're trying to get more rail cars, we're trying to talk about pipelines across northern Minnesota, get the product to market. There's a number of things that need to be done to address that. In addition to worrying about fracking. Done?
The question of sand frac mining frac sand mining is, in my opinion, a classic question of local control. I can think of no good reason why there should be statewide control of frac sand mining. It's a local issue. If you look at the complaints and the issues that people have with the frac sand mines, it's noise, it's dust, it's traffic, all local things. There's really no good reason that I can think of that the state legislature should get involved.
Yeah, I got nothing else. Next.
During television coverage of last year's state Atkins, we saw lots of ads advocating more mining in Minnesota.
Sorry, advocating what? Got it. Thank you.
How would you guys make more jobs in Minnesota to protect the environment and to this industry?
So I think it's me. On this one, I want to back up a little bit. We were talking a minute ago about markets. Warren Buffett made a master stroke about 5 years ago, when he bought Burlington Northern. He's a soothsayer, he's a magic guy, because he must have known that this oil boom was coming and he was going to make a ton of money shipping oil across the country. In the meantime, the Keystone XL pipeline and the Sandpiper mine in northern Minnesota have been blocked. How nice for Mr. Buffett. But that's how markets work. People see things coming and they invest their money and buy rail cars, pipelines, they do things to meet a need. Government these days is generally in the way. It's regulating, it's stopping, it's slowing down, it's otherwise stopping the economic activity that will solve the economic problem for us. Now the question was mining in northern Minnesota, right? I went to a presentation just recently. I'm running out of time. I'll be very brief. Went to a presentation very recently from the government affairs guy from Polymet Mining. He was talking about what they're doing. They are reusing pits, tailing stations, a lot of equipment, and their wastewater is better, quite a bit better, than the drinking water in the towns. So good that when it rains, they have to retreat the water if they don't cover the pits. I don't think there's a whole lot to worry about, and I think this should move forward.
So in the last 50 years, right, we've had Democrats, we've had Republicans, and we even had one independent wrestler type as our governor. And in that 50 years, we have never streamlined regulations more environmental regulations than we have in the last 2 years. In fact, I carried some of those repeals. That being said, and this is the only time I'm going to read anything because this comes from Brad Moore, who's the Executive Vice President for PolyMet. And what Brad said, quote, "It has been a very long process. It typically is in America. But in going through that process, the project has improved. The environmental compliance or environmental impacts are lessened. And as a result, we're going to be sure to meet all state and federal requirements in order to actually operate the mine. We have been pleased with the level of coordination between the agencies," he said. "They're appropriately tough on us, but they've also been fair." At the end of the day, we've got to make sure that that mine is going to safely operate and be environmentally sound. And even the folks at PolyMet, when you extract all of the politics and what the Republicans are saying or what the Democrats are saying, and we're all on the offense and defense, this is what PolyMet is saying. They said it's been a tough process, but it's improved the project. I'm going with what PolyMet says. Done?
Somehow it doesn't surprise me that the guy in charge of government affairs for PolyMet is making nice with his regulators. That doesn't surprise me. But I want to point out that I worked at the Minnesota DNR in 1979. And in 1979, I worked on a mapping study having to do with environmental impact statements for copper nickel mining in northern Minnesota. It was roughly, not the same company, not the same, but it was still a proposed mine. It's been 40 years that those people have been waiting to open a mine up there. Streamlined or not, it seems like a long time.
In general, how much of state government seeks to increase employment in Minnesota? What methods of stimulus would bring the best results?
What methods of stimulus would bring the best results in terms of job creation? First off, and both Democrats and Republicans can take credit for what's happened in the last few years, but mostly small employers can take credit for what's happened in the last few years. I'm one of those people. 162,000 new jobs have been created in Minnesota. We've got, and I'm just going to go, we've got the 5th fastest growing economy in the country, according to the U.S. Bureau of Economics Analysis. We've got the 8th best state for business. And that's not some liberal magazine saying that's Forbes. Remember Steve Forbes ran as a Republican for president? It made a 12-point jump in being the best state for business. It was the largest jump any state had made. So we're doing some things right. Not just Democrats and Republicans, but mostly employers themselves are doing some good things here in Minnesota. In terms of what we can do in the future, there's 2 key things. There's lots of things, but 2 key things. Number one, and I talk to CEOs all the time as a chair of the Commerce Committee, the number one thing that they say, make sure you give us an educated workforce. They don't talk about taxes, they don't talk about regulations, they don't talk about anything else. It's their number one priority. They talk about give us students that can work, that know what they're doing, give us that educated workforce. That's why we're in Minnesota, that's why we're growing in Minnesota, that's why we're going to stay in Minnesota. And that's from folks as close as our Fortune 500, number 2 on the Fortune 500 list, CHS. Just a few miles off to the side of us here. So that's number one. Number 2 is it doesn't hurt to give them a little bit of their money back. And I actually chief authored a bill that gave them $346 million back. That was the largest tax cut for business in state history. Now, which one of you guys, I'm seeing time over here and one over here, but all right, I give up, but it was the largest tax cut for small businesses in Minnesota state history. Done?
I'm always happy to hear a legislator talk about small business and how important it is and how it's where the jobs come from. Because it's the only place jobs come from. Businesses create jobs. When states create jobs, they tax one guy and give to another guy, and for every job they create, they destroy a little bit more than one. That's the economic reality. You can talk about education, people talk about how the University of Minnesota creates jobs by giving us an educated workforce. At best, that's off in the future. That's a distant investment. And the business people, again, I'm not surprised they come to someone like Mr. Atkins and say, oh, how wonderful things are, give us an educated workforce. Because that's the only thing you can do. And what are they going to say? I hate this state and I'm leaving. That's what Medtronic has effectively said. That's what Burger King effectively said to the United States. They don't talk about that, they do it. And they don't usually do it by saying, I hate this state, I'm leaving. They just don't locate here in the first place. And we have some of that too. So I think it's important to remember that the premise of the question is wrong. The state government or the national government can't create jobs. All it can do is shift money around. And that's never a net benefit.
I don't know, cutting taxes, creating an educated workforce, streamlining regulations, those all seem like pretty good things if I'm a small business owner, and I am. And I support those things. I didn't need the full 30 for that, no. Uh-oh. Would we mess up, Mr. Hoverson?
Just want to make sure the transition happens properly. Coin?
All right, now we'll come to that more experimental part of the debate where we're allowing the candidates to each ask a question of the other. So,
Call the last one. Representative Atkins.
Yes, it is.
It is tails. So, would you like to ask first?
I was going to say either way, I'll defer to Don, whatever he wants to ask her.
I'll go second.
Okay, well, I'll give you a choice, Don. I got two questions and you can answer either one. The first one is, we raised taxes. I'm surprised you didn't talk about it. We raised taxes to the top 2% in 2013. Would you repeal that tax increase on folks making $400,000 or $1 million a year? And if you did, what would you cut in order to not have that $2 billion in the state budget? Or, if I happen to get reelected in 2015, what advice would you have for me? You can pick either question.
At least the sound system still works. First I'd like to point out, I have some notes here about the taxes. As I understand it, taxes went up about $2.2 billion in total. And the state budget, all funds budget, went up about $4 billion. And so there's an approaching $2 billion deficit, plus there's a bunch of spending like the expansion of Medicaid that is currently funded by the federal government, where that federal government funding is going to end, which promises yet more deficits. It seems to me that the question is not right. The way you should work this is, you need to figure out what you have to spend money on, and limit your state government to those things. Then you go back and you figure out how to pay for those things. To go it the other way and say, let's see how much money we can get from the taxpayers, and then spend it all and a little bit more, and then come back and demand even more, is the way it seems to be approached, usually, and I don't accept that. If it were up to me, I would go back to that earlier premise. I would take a hard look at everything in the budget, and I don't think it's fair to say that there aren't things that could be cut. And once we have that pared down to the essential things, then I'd go back to the tax bill and say, are we taking too much? Because you got to remember, taxation is spending. I'm sorry, spending is taxation. Once you've spent that money, you have to tax it, either through debt, today's taxes, or tomorrow's taxes. So you have to get control of the spending first and foremost, and that's the point, not the taxation.
My question was, what would you cut?
When I worked at the DNR, my little funny epithet was, I would be the first guy I would fire, because I don't think I did much very useful. I am not in a position right now to go through and say chapter and verse which things would be cut, but I think it's fair to say that there's a fair amount of fat in the budget. I know that the increase in spending since Dayton became governor has been substantial. I would probably start with many of those things that have been increased, because we obviously were living without them before then. But I did not come equipped with that list.
And thank you. Do I have 30 seconds then? Am I supposed to respond? Is that how the format works? And I appreciate the response. important to, well, I'll leave it at that. I'll take whatever your question is next time.
Go ahead. The MNsure program, I think, has been accurately portrayed as a train wreck. The state spent $160 million rolling out a website that didn't work. The executive director was in Costa Rica during the rollout while it melted down. The program has enrolled only a third as many people as projected, and of those enrolled, only 17% are on private plans. Few enough that there's some real worry that there isn't enough money to support the something like $60 million a year it's going to cost to run the board. The rest of the 83% are on Medicaid and Minnesota Care, which we didn't need a MNsure exchange to do. Preferred One recently pulled out of those 17%, 60% of them, so we're down to what, 8% or 7%. And they said it was financially and administratively unsustainable to stay the exchange. Since you were the chief author of the bill that created MNsure and co-chair of the Legislative Oversight Committee responsible for it, can you tell us what went wrong and what you would do differently if you had the chance to do it over again?
I'd hire a different vendor, without a doubt. The vendor that got the website going did a really poor job, and as a result, the rollout was terrible. In terms of the competition among the vendors, among the various plans, they've done a phenomenal job of competing with one another. It's a very fierce set of competition that has driven down prices, and that's why we have the lowest prices for health insurance anywhere in the country. But the thing you've got to remember also, and I've never heard you, Don, talk about repealing MNsure. I've heard you criticize it, but I've never heard about repeal. And maybe in your 30 seconds you can say whether you support repeal. The reason I carried it, the chief reason, was because Minnesota has done a phenomenal job of building a healthcare system. And if we didn't adopt our own health exchange, the default was a federal version. Now in Wisconsin, where they opted for that, they've got rates that are 85% higher than they are here in Minnesota. And Minnesota and Wisconsin are not that much different. But the chief difference is the fact that we did our own. We've got lower rates. We also, as you alluded to, we've seen 160,000 more Minnesotans get health insurance as a result of either MNsure or going into one of the public programs. Now, why should you be concerned about the public program? Because you're starting to think, well, this is just, that's money coming out of my own pocket, right? The fact is those folks get health care when they don't have insurance, but where do they go? And what do you want to take a guess? Where do people without insurance go? Smart folks over here. They go to the emergency room, and it costs 1,000 times more. And those costs just get passed along in the form of higher property taxes or in the form of higher income taxes. So you're paying for it one way or the other. We've got 40% more Minnesotans have health insurance. We're now the #2 state in the country as far as providing insurance or people having insurance. Those sorts of things, as well as the competitive rates, are excellent, excellent outcomes. But we did need a different vendor to get the website operating well.
Well, it would be nice if so many problems could be fixed by a simple switch of vendors. I think there was more at work. I also think that there's a lot more to the failure of MNsure than just we may have the lowest healthcare insurance in the country. That says nothing about whether we have care. And when people don't have insurance, they go to the emergency room. But there are studies out there that show that even when they do have insurance, they go to the emergency room. Need more time.
I'm okay with him having more time.
No.
Closings? Who remembers who's supposed to go first for that? I think did I go first in the openings? Okay, so you get to go first in the closing.
Who is it?
So I get to go first both times?
No, you were first. Oh, wait, no.
See, it's not just us two that are open.
This is on you guys.
Who remembers who went first in the opening? Was that me? All right, so Don, you get to go first.
I go first. Okay.
It's all right, you guys. It's hard to keep track back and forth.
Okay. You've seen here today, I hope, two very different versions of what government is and what it should do. Is government the place where those with political connections go to tussle over who gets a piece of the government pie? Or is government where we carefully tackle only those few tasks that can only be accomplished together? Should your legislature be working hard to find ways to tax your neighbors, to give you what you want? Or should that legislator be guardian of every taxpayer's wallet, letting the states raise your taxes only for truly compelling reason? Is deal-making ability and good relations with interest groups a job qualification? My opponent's vision is of government as supervisor and benefactor, making our choices for us, protecting us mostly from ourselves. This vision says we can't. We can't make smart choices, we can't pay our own way, we can't be trusted to treat our fellow citizens well, we can't be trusted to take responsibility for things like our own health care. This is government as master. I believe in the vision of our founders as described in our Declaration of Independence. The vision has echoes in every fight for freedom all over the world for the last 2 centuries. Thomas Jefferson put it well. The issue today is the same as it has been throughout all history, whether a man shall be allowed to govern himself or ruled by a small elite. We have to govern ourselves. We have to restore self-government. We have to embrace our duties as citizens. We must all embrace the responsibility of governing, of choosing. We must ensure that our government is not a tool for one citizen to impose his will on another. My liberty depends on my granting the same to you. Entitlements for some are obligations imposed on others, and government obligations are imposed by force. You came here today to do your duty as citizens, to learn about us, the candidates for Minnesota House. One of us will represent you for the next 2 years. Will we stand up as citizens and embrace the ideals that have made us an engine of prosperity and a beacon of hope for the whole world? Or will we give that responsibility up and let an ever-growing government slowly smother our prosperity and make us servant and government master? I ask for your vote. Join me in restoring self-government.
You could clap for that. That was good. I just made up my own words. Speaking of clapping, by the way, would you join me in thanking our friends from St. Thomas and Visitation? This is the first time ever that we've had something like this. Coach, you're all right too. It was, yeah, I know, they get all the credit. I also want to thank my opponent for his willingness to go. Don and I had lunch together a couple months ago. We had a great lunch. We talked about family, we talked about a variety of things.
And I didn't pay. And I didn't pay.
And Don did not pay. I told you I don't take lunch from anybody. But we had a nice conversation. We said there ought to be debates. And we didn't know how that was going to happen. And this is how it happens. And we appreciate you guys coming. And I thought it was a good back and forth. I also want to thank Don. He did something that most people wouldn't. I invited him to show up for Inver Grove Heights Days. He and Connie came and pushed grocery carts with us in the Inver Grove Heights Days Parade and collect food for neighbors, which is our local food shelf. People don't do that in politics. And yet Don and Connie and oh my goodness, I'm going to remember before I get done here. But Sally, right? Did I get it? Sally English came as well. They wore their Don Lee shirts, and we collected about 2,000 pounds of food and school supplies and household stuff. You really can work together. And at the end of the day, we're Minnesotans. It's the partisan stuff you can check at the door sometimes, and it's amazing what you can do when you work together. I've been going door to door now for the last few months. I've visited with people like Don. I've heard from students here in the room. I've got kind of my top 10 list so far in terms of priorities for the 2015 session. I apologize for reading, but I wrote them down. Number 1 was balance the state budget without shifts or gimmicks or borrowing and without any new taxes. Most of the new tax increase that we passed 2 years ago went to pay back a loan that was taken from our schools, a $2.8 billion loan that was used to balance the last state budget. Number 2 is fairer funding for suburban schools. We get short shrift in the burbs just because of where we live and because we haven't had adequate representation only just in terms of numbers. Now we do. Whether it's Don or me, we got to fight for fairer funding for our schools in the suburbs. Number 3 is property tax relief. 12% reductions in our area the last 2 years, but prior to that we've seen property taxes going up and up and up, and we can bring them down. Number 4 is continue our efforts to prevent scams that target Minnesota seniors. We are the #1 target in the United States for scammers because we don't hang up the phone. We're the nicest people in the world, and we get scammed. Number 5 is continuation of the college tuition freeze. Number 6 is fix deteriorating roads and bridges. That's a huge, huge issue. It's going to be a key priority, maybe the #1 priority for the 2015 session. 7 is repeal obsolete laws that no longer make sense. Nobody repealed more laws last session than I did, but we've still got more work to do to streamline things. That's number 8 as well. Number 9 is legislation that honors Officer Scott Patrick. I've heard from a lot of folks here in Mendota Heights about his passing. We should do that, Don. Regardless of who wins in November, we ought to do that. And number 10 is continue to work in bipartisan fashion. I hear that again and again and again. It's that we've seen the gridlock in DC. We expect better, and we ought to get better here in Minnesota. With that, thank you all very much. Thank you, Don. Thank you, St. Thomas, for hosting this and Visitation. We appreciate it.